Hello. As she said, my name is Sean McNamara. I live in Chicago. I work at Wargaming, our Chicago Institute. I have about 8 years now experience, multiple studios, multiple platforms, multiple releases. So I've been in QA for the most of that. I did some minor design work here and there. So that's enough about me. We're going to get right into it. The importance of QA tools and tools specifically for a QA. First, let's talk a little bit about the tools that QA normally has. Throughout the studios, you usually have an email system set up and some type of bug tracking software, whether this is Excel sheets that are shared to a Google Drive or stuff like Handsoft or Jira or a more proprietary system. Those are usually the two big ones you have. And then some type of software to push builds to your kits, whether that's mobile or PC or Xboxes and PS4s and stuff like that. Rarely does QA have access to either other tools or development tools. Development tools are a lot different. They're usually used for development, so they'll have Adobe Suites, Jira, and stuff like Maya, Max, ZBrush for artists, proprietary software for designers. This can be very expensive to get licenses for, especially if you have a large QA department. At one time, our QA department was over 35 people. As you can imagine, getting Adobe licenses for 35 people for QA to have access to that was not really something we wanted to do. So this becomes a problem, not only monetarily, but in the aspect that these tool sets may not even be useful for QA. You know, that may be more of an artist thing. So several issues can come up that can affect the production cycle. Sorry, I'm falling back on the slides here. And please excuse my voice. I'm recovering from being sick, so I may clear my throat a little bit. So there's several issues that can affect the production cycle. It's time limitations, and they can all be related back to QA not having a proper tool system. For example, there was a previous studio I worked at, and we were working on a platform title. And we had no real tools for QA. It was for a mobile platform. And at one point in the development cycle, we ran into an issue regarding the player not having enough currency or having enough currency to purchase a particular upgrade for an item that progressed the game. So we went back and we tried to access the file that had the save on it. And the player had enough money, but the store no longer recognized the item in the store at all. So it essentially blocked the game and stopped progression. So we weren't sure where this stemmed from, and we had no tools to access the amount of currency. So we couldn't add 1 or 100 or 5,000. We had to grind it out. So we had to grind out different files, save these files, and test them across the platforms. So in a sense, what happened was you end up with 8 files, 12 files, 20 files in a day, all with different currency, and we still couldn't figure out the problem. After a couple days, it turned out that if you had the exact amount of gold to buy the item, the store wouldn't recognize it and would therefore remove the item from the shop and count it as purchased, but the player would not receive it and halted the progress. Now, unfortunately, because, like I said, we didn't have a way to adjust the amount of currency the player got, this issue took days. It would have been much quicker, and we would have been able to progress through the game a lot easier if we would have had a tool set that allowed us to do that. Unfortunately, that's not something we had. As you can see from that example, it's easy to throw a wrench into the testing process, and development's not always aware of these problems. We wasted a lot of time, and a lot of time could be spent developing better processes and further testing the game when you have tool sets like this. Another example is at a previous studio, we were working on a title that it was a platformer title, and we had 5 hub worlds with 3 to 7 individual worlds inside of these hubs. Overall, there was a good deal of terrain to check for bounding issues, object interaction, enemy interactions, and again, we had no specific QA tool set up. So what we had to do was progress the game to each world, save this save file to a globally shared file system, and then every morning when you come in, If you were testing World 2, you'd pull down this file, prop your system with it, and go with there. Well, as you can guess, this led to people accidentally saving old files, rewriting files, deleting files. At one time, we had 7 files all saved for the same world, and it was just a mess. And we would frequently have problems with corrupted save files and overridden save files. This ended up wasting so much time compiling other issues in development that the release date was eventually delayed by almost a month. Eventually, 2 worlds were taken out of the game due to testing. And as the game was released, it pushed back 7 other titles that we had in the process. And as such, it eventually led to the layoff of half the studio, and I was one of those people that got laid off. Again, sorry. With proper tools to be able to change the state of the game, the save files, the location of the player, QA would not only have had a more quickly and reliable way to test, but the results would have been quicker, more reliable, and we would have created better bugs. And we also would have been able to complete the game, the full testing cycle, and in all likelihood, we would have released a more complete and more exciting game. Now, all this can affect the team, the studio, and the project in multiple aspects. Having QA complete tasks such as manual level progression, currency farming, and enemy and obstacle checks can be a very long and tedious process that is mandatory at some point, but this is not something that the QA should have to do on a daily basis when testing out every level or every object. Having to do these tests manually without tools to allow the tester to move back and forth between levels, change game states or currency or stats, all we are doing is wasting the time that the QA department could be testing more critical changes or newer functionality. This wasted time can easily lead to untested or improperly tested features, live bugs, unimplemented changes, and it can even end up cutting content from releases. Having buggy releases or delayed releases or cut content can lead to all sorts of internal problems within the studio, everything from decreased IP interest to cut back on hours for many different types of employees, and in some instances, layoffs. Now it should be obvious that these tools bring to QA. By creating tools specifically designed for QA and their testing practices, we give our testers more opportunity to test more thoroughly and more efficiently. Spending less time grinding at mundane tasks such as level progression or currency farming. This all gives the tester greater opportunity to make sure every section of the game is tested properly, and it allows the tester to not have to rely upon shared files or shared files that can be easily overridden or lost. It allows the tester to become more familiar with the game itself and waste less time on the prerequisites of quests or events. On a recent project I was working on, when we first started, we had to test certain aspects of the game in multiple languages. Now, this wasn't a large portion of the game. It was mainly title screens, menus, anything related to in-game purchasing, the gold signs. Well, this took a little bit of time to reset the kit, change out the languages, relaunch the title, test the areas necessary, and then do that again for all of the efigs. So our team decided to incorporate a method to reset the kit, change the language, and then relaunch the build with a QA tool. This effectively saved our department a ton of time and allowed our testers to quickly and reliably switch the languages on any console and reinstall the build in that language in 40% less time. We were now able to test almost any part of the game in any language, which allowed our testing to become more complete and catch more loc bugs. So let's talk about specific tools. I think we're all on board with saying that QA-specific tools are important and can help the team and the company. So what type of tools are needed for your company or in general? There's various tools we can use, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'm going to mention a couple to bring to your attention. Tools for builds and deployment, allowing for automated installation of the newest builds or projects to be pushed or directly downloaded to your PC or kit. Some cases, this can even be pushed out to all the kits in the department. This cuts down on the time waiting on installs or waiting on builds or daily props in the morning and allows your testers to get quicker into testing. Currently, we have a tool that installs builds from multiple projects and multiple branches. It can install anything in our department, all depending on the needs of the QA department. Tools for accessing data and debug information. Specifically, debug information isn't readily available on standard builds. Having this debug information being able to grab directly from a kit, save to a text file or whatever file is necessary, allows the tester to include this information in your bugs and give that to the engineer or developer for a more thorough bug, and a bug that the engineers or design can easily replicate and fix. Again, tools that allow for rapid changes in game states and values, the unlocking of equipment, weapons, avatar props, and accessories, and everything else without manual progression greatly increases the amount of coverage that your QA can do. The ability to alter stats, currency, and any other changeable numeric value in the game without the need of grinding. The ability to access any level, map, area in the game without having to rely on external saves, specific or new specific builds cuts down on the time greatly. Tools to simulate players in large testing matches by creating simple AI to add in for performance testing. Now, this isn't usually something that a normal game would do, but currently I work for World of Tanks, and we have 15 on 15, so we can't always have 15 people at a time. We rely on simple AI to follow around the map. We currently have a tool that excuse me. We currently have a tool function that allows us to select what items and what tanks are delivered out to our testers. We are able to give different testers, different tanks, and different equipment, load them all into the same mash, and push all these builds to these kits before our testers are even at work, or while they're at lunch, or at the end of the day. So when they come in the morning or back for lunch, we're ready for large-scale play tests with all the equipment that we need for any specific test. Tools for the development of events, specific builds, or challenges for players. Many games now have a weekly live event, sometimes even daily events. In order to properly test these weeks or months in advance, testers need to be able to accurately deploy these builds to their development environment and vet them for bugs and irregularities. In our current game, we have a tool that was initially created to help quickly and easily create events and in-game purchasable content. I specifically worked with the creator of this tool to include features for this, so the tool could deploy the events directly to the game server without the need of two separate programs, which is what we were doing prior to this. This essentially cut down the time it took to prop these builds to our kits and test them by 60%. This allowed us to test these events earlier so that they were more accurate and more bug-free, and eventually this tool was more widely accepted and used by our development team, and even led to a separate team dedicated to the creation and development of these events for our players within QA. Tools for providing data and information for testers that is not readily available in the game. A lot of stats are calculated through various tool sets underside of game and in code, and players never see this. For us, that requires multiple files, so this can get confusing. We have a tool that is made almost specifically for QA, and it was created to allow our testers to have access to all the stats for any tanks, ammo, crew, or items that we have in our game. This tool pulls all the information from various files and displays them in a neat and orderly fashion, similar to how it would look in game. Normally, this information is stored in multiple files, and all the testers would have to download all these files, locate them, where they were testing, and in some cases, cross-reference items, tanks, turrets, and packages, and then do mathematical calculation to get the data that is displayed to the player. That's obviously not a good thing, and we wanted to fix that. And the last thing I would say was tools that allow our tester to access any tank, any item, or any stat in game and uses live updated files that were never using outdated files. The tool that I mentioned that allows us to access any tank allows us to actually pull the data as it's changed by our design team from a master list of code. So I know what you're saying now. This sounds great. But where do we begin? How do we go about creating these tools? Where do we even go for gathering the information to begin with? I can tell you about the creation of the tools that came out for our testers. This all came about for our testers looking to speed up our testing process. We wanted to be able to test the aspects of the game that would otherwise require large amounts of time or specific data that was otherwise buried in code, or simply to offer solutions to problems such as the entire staff being used to test large-scale playtests. We had meetings amongst ourselves before talking to our engineer department and our testing department to see if someone had the skills and knowledge to create these tools. This led to a specific team dedicated to the creation of QA tools, and later to testing not only these tools, but the development tools used by the development team. This is something I was a part of. I was previously on the QA tools team at our work. When I started to work on tools, we had 2 QA tools. One predominantly made for changing game states, and the other used for installing builds, deploying builds, and altering function of the kits, like language. These were maintained by our QA engineer, who I worked with, to test their functionality. But there came a time when we were starting to add very frequent events to our game. The current process was a manual file creation using scripting. I knew that one of the technical designers, and he was creating a new development tool to handle the creation of these events in a more user-friendly way, so that the events could be created and altered much easier than it was being handled at the time. So I started thinking, how am I going to test this tool? What will I need to know about the events that we're pushing and how they're created? Then I took it a step further and I said, well, how is the QA team itself going to be able to test these events? What would they need? I started bringing my questions and concerns to the technical designer first to address these issues as he was creating the tool. I wanted to understand how these events were being created and how these files were being shared as they were before the tool. How these events were being stored in one type of file and then converted to another type of file. And lastly, how this tool was using another tool to push these files to the game. This seemed out of date and obsolete to me. So at first, I just wanted to facilitate my testing process for the development tool itself, so I could set up test cases for the tools department to properly test out, excuse me, so I could properly test the tool itself. I ended up working with him to put functionality in that would help out QA and all departments not only create these events, but create them quickly and add in time-saving functionality. For instance, instead of having to manually script out these events, we added in a manual, instead of having to manually script out these events, save the file, reconvert the file to another format, and then use a separate tool to deploy this file and event to the kit, which was our method, we can now use a more friendly interface that had drag and drop functionality to create the events and then move the file to the correct format and deploy that file to our kits. This saved the team a lot of time and frustration and allowed QA and the whole studio itself to set up and access these events for testing and creation very quickly. I also remember a time in the pre-launch era of World of Tanks for console when we had a very large QA staff. We had over 30 people, and we ran into multiple issues pulling down builds on a daily basis. All these builds were stored on a shared drive, and we would have 30 people at a time pulling down the builds. This slowed down the network horribly, and sometimes it took an hour and 45 minutes for everyone to get set up in the morning, and that's an hour and 45 minutes that we wasted. So we decided trying out other things. We ended up having different shifts. So we had 3 shifts. We had a morning shift, a night shift, and an afternoon shift. And it still didn't work. So we tried having one person push all builds to QA. That led to separate issues: corrupted builds, incorrect builds, builds not getting propped correctly. So we looked to our QA tools team at the time and devised a tool that could initially set up and install builds onto everyone's PC at varying times overnight based on their schedules, and that way we wouldn't flood the network. This tool later expanded and was able to set up large-scale playtests and push specific builds and user data onto individual kits so that the leads or the manager or whoever was in charge of the playtest for that day could set up specific playtests for the end of the day or for the following morning before everyone arrived. So going back to the question of how do we start this? how do we go about creating these tools and getting this ball rolling? The first step is for the department to determine where the bottlenecks are, and this is QA's responsibility. Where does your team spend time on tedious tasks? How can they be avoided? Can a tool help? What issues has your department had that keep coming up? Is there a way that these could be avoided? Is there a way that some type of tool could help that? Is there people in your department with the skill set to create these tools? If so, let's start a dialogue with them and your leads, and possibly the engineering team. Let them know of the issues that you're having and a plan to solve them, and how you plan to go about it. In our case, we ended up dedicating the team to this, and this was mostly formed out of QA and one engineer. But maybe your team is composed of new industry employees. Maybe they don't have the programming knowledge to create these tools. Then what? Again, communication. Talk to your leads, let them know of these issues, let them know of your solutions. See if an engineer can help. Maybe you're able to hire a new employee, an entry-level employee that has QA and engineering experience, and maybe they can start this team and grow this team. The cases are wide and varied, and they all depend on your studio and your situation. So it's safe to say that all these tools functioning allow the QA department to work more quickly and more efficiently, and give the team a greater opportunity to become more familiar, excuse me. Allow your team to become more familiar with the intricacies of the game. By having to spend less time on tedious tasks, this speeds up the experience growth of the team, creates more valuable and experienced testers, and this is also a good way to have your team members shine. Having a critical thinking team that identifies issues and proposes solutions to these problems and is a way to bring accolades and acknowledgement to you and your team. This also creates an upward path for the QA. So that a QA member with an engineering skill set can gain more experience, have their code used by the studio, or possibly even move to another department later. This all gives testers in the QA department the opportunities to enhance their skill sets and their work knowledge, and it speeds the testing processes, allowing for quicker iterations, more thorough and more intelligent testing. But the thinking process of testers attempting to devise and think about new ways to simplify and even automate testing is something that needs to be taught, something that needs to be spread, and something that needs to be learned. This must be ingrained in your QA's training so that it becomes instinct to improve upon the testing process, not just the testing alone. This requires the help of other teams, though, and will require patience and discussions. But without the ability to get together and create these tools, the advancement of my game and World of Tanks and the department would not have been possible. The addition of the QA tools give the studio the opportunity to train, to grow, to promote staff from within, all while increasing productivity and morale. This all leads to greater development process for all departments, allowing for more extensive features and additions to the game, faster implementation, faster iteration on levels, combat, and basically every aspect of the game. To summarize, QA-specific tools can be utilized so that the department can quickly adjust console functions, in-game functions, download new builds, and a variety of other functions to fit your department's needs. It cuts down greatly on time spent on medial or tedious tasks. This leads to a higher quality of bugs being written earlier in the development cycle and increases the knowledge and experience of your team and the studio. This can lead to new opportunity for your team to grow, expand, and advance their careers. This allows the studio to iterate on features quickly, catch bugs earlier, and overall ship a higher quality game. QA tools have just as much important as any other development tool and benefit the entire studio. I hope you can all take away something from this information today and begin to develop some QA tools at your own company. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, so much for the presentation. I already have a question. What's your favorite tool?
I would have to say one of the tools I was talking about, it's called Pantheon. Mm-hmm. It allows us to access any stat that is allowed in the game, and currently every tank uses roughly 4 different files in our file system. So without having to access Perforce and pull up the files for the tank, the files for the gun itself, the files for the ammo, and the files for the crew, and then doing formulas to actually find out that stat, Pantheon allows us to pull all these files from a shared direct drive and then displays that information easily and quickly for the testers. So everyone can access all the information they need and the way it's displayed to the player in-game without having to dig or do tons of math.
Cool, thank you. Dear audience, please ask your questions. I need a helper with microphone. Here.
Hey, thanks for the talk. I think this stuff's really important for like modern game development. So yeah, thank you for presenting it. I think there's some really good stuff in there. I'd like to echo your encouragement for people in QA to kind of embrace sort of scripting and all these types of things to actually, grab the bull by the horns and potentially get into sort of QA engineer or something like this. But yeah, I was just wondering if you guys do any like automated testing, so like QA like actually writing scripts that they can then run on a server or something like that.
We have very few scripts nowadays. Unfortunately, our QA engineer department has all been promoted. So our QA tools department is no more at the moment, and we're restructuring it because we had 3 QA tools engineers, and they were actually promoted to full engineers. One of them's a full-time build engineer, one of them now works in UI engineering, and I believe the other one is in actual development tools. So unfortunately, it kind of fell by the wayside, and we're in the process of restructuring a lot of stuff. We did have scripts that were specifically written to push new events. We do have scripts work that is used in one of our tools to like fake purchasing items, to fake load in other bots. So that information is readily available and taught and given to all of our QA members. We have Confluence pages, and I know how to do it personally. So a lot of times as they go through the process of learning how to use that tool and purchase stuff without having to grind out gold, they get the knowledge of learning how to do that scripting a little bit, and that kind of brings them forward in their technical growth. So then we can kind of look at who is picking up on that and who is going, oh, well, I wrote this script for how to get this one kind of turret and on these kind of tanks. And we're like, okay, great. Maybe we can start bringing them forward and having them meet with engineering. So I hope that.
Right.
Yeah, hello. Nice lecture.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the specific software that you're using to push the builds to your QAs.
Yes.
Because I don't really understand the meta here. You're referring to testers as testers who, like, just ordinary people, public people who get paid with the in-game gold to test the game?
No,
You're referring
only testers.
You mean like QA engineers?
Yeah, I believe in. They're not engineers, but they're QA testers, but they're in-house, so they're.
That's basically the low end of QA. Yeah, I see. Well, if that's the case, then I understand. What software are you using to push the builds that you need them to test?
We have a proprietary software that we actually have written that it's literally called QA Toolset.
Okay, and then why didn't you use the WGC to do that?
Pardon me?
The Wargaming Game Center.
Why didn't I use?
Or didn't you use to do that? Why didn't you use Wargaming Game Center to push the builds that they need?
They're not integrated into any of that right now. We're in the process of having our tools engineers, our development tools engineers integrate that tool. That tool was created separately out of a necessity. Then at the time, the development tools engineers didn't have the time to integrate and create a tool separate. So our team created it separately, and it requires a different functionality. Now we're in the process of integrating that due to the fact that our tools engineering team was disbanded.
Because we used to create like separate installers. I'm the QA from the World of Warplanes.
Okay.
So we basically had separate tasks for every QA, like in-house QA engineer.
Okay.
Assigned to them by using Jira or some bug tracking software.
Right.
And they used Perforce to get the build that they need.
Right.
And accessed all the files. But the testers, we basically created them the separate installers for them to install. well, we didn't really have any problems with that. That's why I asked.
Okay, yeah. See,
Yeah.
when our process is more streamlined now, a lot of the stuff I mentioned where this is how we used to do it was a few years ago now. So our process is a lot more streamlined now. But at the time, we didn't have our development tools engineers didn't have the time to facilitate tools builds directly for us. So we reached out amongst ourselves and kind of said, how do we work out this problem so we can move faster? And that's how we did it.
Yeah, I see.
But now it's all either integrated or in the process of being integrated right now.
And the game center helps a lot, to
Yes.
just distribute the stuff.
Yeah, because that way we're able to. Well, hopefully that way we'll be able to easily distribute it.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Hey,
Hi.
thank you for your time. You mentioned performance testing, and can you tell more about how do you test performance, how do you test your levels, and how do you use AI in testing? You mentioned it, but it's interesting.
Predominantly we do it all by physical body at the moment, but due to our shifts, we use two different tools to create the AI that follows an AI path and an AI structure that was written by our technical designer to basically just go from one side of the map looking for players and attacking them. So what we end up doing is spawning 10 to 14 of those on the opposite team. One QA member will do this for themselves on their own build. We'll spawn 14 of those AI simulated bots, and then they can also do the same with the same team. So you can have yourself as the only playable character and basically everyone else is bots on the map. Now, I wish I had more technical information on that for you. I did not write any of that work myself. I am not an engineer. I do not do programming. I only helped facilitate those processes because we saw it as a problem that needed to be solved. So we brought that to our QA engineers and sat down with them and worked with them to install this. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information on the back end of that, but every QA in our department is able to set up those tests individually and then bring those bots into specific map tests within the game without having to disrupt the whole build. I hope that answers your question a little bit. Sorry.
Any more questions, please? That's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much
Thank
again
you.
for the lecture. Thank you, audience, for listening. Any questions?